Hey everybody, welcome back to God's Playing Your Part. Today we are in Amos, so we are starting another prophetic book. We are in chapters 1 through 5 today, and it is a real doozy. There are a lot of serious judgments coming down on the people of Israel in both Judah as well as
Israel,
thank you. Anyway, so it is it's pretty intense. There's a lot of very straightforward forthcoming doom for these people in all of Israel and all of Judah, and Amos does not hold back.
So I very much enjoyed reading over Amos, which is sort of weird. But just to give you a little bit of context, we're entering into a different book at this time. Amos most likely was prophesying. He references Uzziah, so we've been talking about King Uzziah in Judah. Uzziah was that king that did pretty well as long as he had good counselors around him, and then pride got to him. He started doing crazy things.
Got leprosy to the end of his days.
So that's in Judah in the south. Israel in the north has been going kind of crazy the whole time. Ahab wreaked a lot of havoc. Amos was probably prophesying around 760 BC. So yesterday we were reading Isaiah. The day before that we were reading Isaiah. Isaiah most likely started prophesying in 740 BC. So give or take,
They're pretty close.
They're pretty close, and they most likely were aware of each other. Amos was actually from the region in Judah, and so that makes it even more likely that Isaiah knew who Amos was. We're going to be dealing with a lot of prophets that are around the same time. And so when Amos is proclaiming these things for Israel and Judah, Isaiah is proclaiming very similar things for Israel and Judah. So it is obvious that God is really trying hard to get these people's attention. We talked about how the northern kingdom is going to be carried into exile in 722, which means when Amos started prophesying, it was only about 40 years until these people were ultimately judged and carried away.
Closer, yeah.
So I love that kind of history stuff, and I don't want to belabor it. But that is helpful stuff to know. Also, a really helpful historical fact is that Amos 1:1 talks about, I'm just going to read it. In the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. Which is a significant thing. It gets your attention. Oh, what earthquake? Well, Zechariah in Zechariah 14:5 talks about the earthquake. He says in Zechariah 14:5, and you shall flee the valley of the mountains. The valley of the mountains shall reach to Azal, and you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. So that's the same event. These are two different authors talking about the same thing. And archaeology shows us that there was some significant seismic activity in the region of these prophets around 760 BC. So this is just one way that actual archaeology supports what the Bible says, which to me is always wow, if what it says about archaeology is true, you can't just reject it like it doesn't matter. So I love that stuff. So with all that being said, here's Amos.
Yeah, right. I think whenever I think of Amos, first of all, I always think of I always have a mental picture of what some of these guys look like, and I can't get Amish out of my head at all. There's so many Amish Amoses. That sounds terrible.
It's fine.
Anyway,
just don't mix up the letters.
Yep, for sure. What I caught right away is a common thread within at least the first chapter, first two chapters, is there's this idea of everything will be ruined by fire or put to ruin by fire, and there is no coming out without mass destruction and a huge devouring of these people. So at one point, do you remember where that was, Ryan, where they were talking about how it will be of the 1,000 people,
that's later on,
100 will be saved, and
that's in chapter 4.
Is that 4?
Actually, it's chapter 5.
What?
Yeah, it's talking about judgment and restoration.
Sure enough, there it is. Okay, city went out. Okay, so this is, again, just talking about the house of Israel. The city went out. This is verse 3. The city that went out 1,000 shall have 100 left, and that which went out 100 shall have 10 left to the house of Israel. So, this is no little thing. The Lord is talking over and over again through the prophets, hey, I provided for you, you didn't or excuse me, I like gave you opportunities to turn back to me and you didn't take it. Like there were so many chances for you and I'm going to like just strike you down. Like you're so caught up in your own thing, you're caught up in like all the motions and like your hearts are so far from me. Like I'm not even going to hear you. Like the offerings that you give, the praise that you give, I'm not going to listen to you because your heart is not for me, it's for something else. So like because of your disobedience, because of your like I don't know, like your disobedience with like a mask
And
almost.
unrepentance.
Yeah, I'm going to completely annihilate you.
The what is going on in this prophetic book is really it's interesting, and the setup is kind of cruel. The first chapter of Amos is proclaiming the word of the Lord against all of Israel's enemies. So
Right.
the first chapter kind of has this literary device where it's like for 3 transgressions and for 4, that just means completion. So for like everything they've done. There's like 7 kingdoms at this time, like in a pretty small area. And
So we have Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, and the Ammonites and Moab.
Yeah, and it's all these smaller kingdoms that are coming under the threat of this growing Assyrian power. And that Assyrian power is going to overtake all of them. And Amos makes it clear that that is by the Lord, not by the Assyrians.
Yeah.
Like God is raising up this nation to destroy these disobedient nations. But the cruel thing that's happening is when Amos would have been proclaiming this through the first chapter, the Israelites and those from Judah, if they were there, would have been like, yes, we hate those guys. Like those are our enemies. And we are so glad that God is coming against
He
them.
definitely gave them the good news before the bad.
But what's funny is like those are very small pieces. Like it's a couple lines,
yeah.
it's a couple verses, and then we are going to enter into literal chapters
About
of how the
judgment.
Lord is going to punish Israel. And this is a unique time in Israel because they have been relatively successful and relatively prosperous. And the belief at this time would have been we are not against God, because if we were against God, he would not allow us to be prosperous. So you'll see some allusions to this prosperity in the text. Like one of the clearest ones is in chapter 3, verse 15. I will strike the winter house along with the summer house, and the houses of ivory shall perish. There were many people in the kingdom at this time that had more than one house.
It says, and the great houses shall come to an end.
Yes, and like when he talks about the ivory houses, like there were very nice places. But the trick was all of these places were gained by taking advantage of people who had very little. So the people with a lot just kept keeping a lot. And that was actually prohibited by the Lord, like early on in Leviticus. Like they were not supposed to be like keeping and holding all this property. The property was supposed to belong to the families, like the individual families, and they were supposed to release the property every 7 years, but that was not happening.
Our study Bible says much of the nation's wealth had been acquired by oppressing the poor, and so their insincere worship was disgusting to God.
Yeah.
And like think about that. Like even today, when you hear of like serious injustice of like rich taking advantage of the poor, like that like stirs an anger in just like regular old people today. Like how much more anger, like I mean, I even feel it, but also like how much more anger do you think God feels when it's like this representation of God and like to the world, and they're taking advantage of the poor and like the weak, and then turning it back into this insincere worship, like, oh, look at us, like, oh, God, 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 all this, whatever. Meanwhile, they're like under the table, just like taking advantage of every single person under the guise of something else.
One of the themes you're going to see in Amos is that it is terrible when people who are far from God take advantage of people who God loves. It is even more horrendously terrible when people who are called by the name of the Lord and know the name of the Lord do exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
Luckily, that is a problem that was completely dealt with by Amos, and it doesn't exist in our world today.
Yeah.
That is a joke. It is a real bummer when believers do exactly what God asks us not to do, and we continue to act as though we are believers. I've talked to you guys, I don't know, like a day or two ago about my own little story on how like my heart was disgusting and I was not interested in having relationship with God, and I was leading worship in front of my church every Sunday. Like that is wicked before the Lord. And so when we do things like build giant kingdoms for ourselves and say it's because of God. Like, God's not fooled by that.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening here. Like he literally says, this is chapter 4. Well, okay, so this is worth calling out. Chapter 4, starting in verse 6. God talks about all the things that had been happening that was supposed to get their attention but did not. Like, he allowed them to starve. He allowed them to not have rain. And we know that from the stories of Elijah. Like, there was not rain. He gave them blight and mildew. He gave them sickness. He gave them, like, death and destruction by wars. And every time he says, but you did not return to me. You did not return to me. You did not return to me. So because God is gracious and merciful and loving, he does things to get your attention. And he wants you to come back to him. But what he says finally is, therefore, thus I will do to you, Israel, because I will do this to you. Prepare to meet your God, O Israel. That is not a good thing.
That's kind of scary.
And then he spends most of chapter 5 saying, come back to me. Please come back to me. So you get like this kind of bizarre, it's just how the world works. Like, the Lord desires relationship with us. He gives us incredible amounts of opportunity to have relationship with him, but ultimately there is judgment. And when you rebel against God over and over and over and over, you tire out his long-suffering nature and judgment comes. And that is what Amos is doing. He's proclaiming that judgment is going to come. It's been decided. It's going to happen.
I think it's really interesting that, like, you could go a lot of different directions with this, but you were talking like building huge kingdoms for yourself. I think that happens very often in today's church world, because, like, what's interesting about this is we've read a lot about the Lord's judgment coming on, like, the evil that Israel was facing, like the evil kings and the evil, like, kingdoms that were coming up against Israel, and God defended them, and he would judge them and
Protect
get them.
Yeah,
right. However, it is also interesting, like, God will also give this same judgment to these people as well, like to the Israelites.
Even more so.
Yeah, and he's not holding back. So, like, if this can happen to them because of their, like, complete disobedience, because they essentially just made God, like, this really small thing, like, they didn't care about him and they didn't recognize his power because they made him something super duper small. Like you said earlier, you can't fool God. Like, you can't fool him. He's not stupid about what you're trying to, like, show to the world. So, like, it automatically assumes that, like, at least I think the Israelites are like, hey, it doesn't matter because God's like this teeny tiny thing. Like, we're bigger, better. Like, you yourself become, like, more important, more, like, I don't know, in charge than God is.
They believed that their prosperity proved how powerful they were.
Right. And I think, like, small scale, we can do that ourselves.
100%.
Large scale, like, the church can do that as well. And it's, like, I think becoming much more prominent more and more and more as, like, everything has to be bigger, better, the best all the time. And I think that can be a poison in our own lives as well as the church at large.
Because ultimately God looks at them and says, hey, like, why are people starving in your midst?
Yeah.
Why are the poor being, like, trampled in your midst?
Meanwhile,
why are the widows not being cared for in your midst? Like, that building's awesome. What's up with the hungry widows over here? Like, what's going on? And so we just have to be really careful and really cautious. I don't think any of you are surprised by the amount of scandal that's been happening in, church world. I recognize it's not everywhere in church world, but there's a lot of them lately. And I think some of it is, like, I think we need to pay attention to what the Lord is doing. And it's not that having things is bad, but having things and not honoring God with them is very bad. And from what we can see in Amos, like, it's bad when non-believers do it. When believers do it, it's really bad. And so we just need to be really cautious about these things. We need to be really aware of these things. And I think there are things that we can read in Amos that are applicable to us today. And you cannot say that this is some dusty Old Testament concept that we don't have to worry about anymore. because James says true religion is caring for widows and orphans. So the New Testament church had this very clear idea that we need to get our priorities straight and take care of these things. Like one of the first huge scandals was that the widows in Acts 7, I believe, maybe it was Acts 6, were not being fed. And like the apostles were like, we got to take care of this. Like this needs to happen. And so they believed that one of the big functions of church was making sure these widows were cared for.
So what would you say an appropriate dun 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 your part is for today?
I think it is so important for us to do what the Lord has called us to do. And I think it is very easy to get distracted.
Don't forget the mission.
Yeah, I think it is obvious that many organizations have forgotten the mission. And that doesn't mean they're lost. It just means they need to turn back. And I'm not preaching like, oh, let justice roll down. Like that's what Amos says. Like, I don't know that we're in that moment, but definitely like pay attention to what the Lord is doing and ensure that you are in fact serving him, because these folks that Amos is speaking to, they had some pretty mixed up ideas, and God was like, you need to come back to me or judgment is coming. So let's keep our hearts and minds focused on the Lord, and let's honor him with our lives.
Shoot.
We'll be reading some more in Amos.
Some more smack talk.
I would encourage you, I know we're talking a little bit long, but definitely check out this book for yourself. Do not just go off of what I'm saying. Do not just go off of what Jenny is saying. Take some time and listen to the reading, or listen or go read Amos for yourself. We're not making these things up. You can go read it for yourself and check it out. So we'll be back again tomorrow with more of Amos. We'll see you then. Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.